Welcome to another special Saturday edition of Daily Dose of Septuagint, and we are going to continue taking a look at the very famous Codex Sinaiticus. I introduced this last video with a bit of a history of where it came from, why it's important, and just an overview of some of the key features. And this time around, we're going to do a little bit of review, but also get into the Psalms just briefly and sort of do a little bit of reading as well. I'm recording this in the middle of sort of my first foray into the Psalms, and so it's appropriate just to dig in there. As I have been doing, we'll be using a facsimile edition of this codex, very nicely put together by Hendrickson Publishers. You can actually still buy a copy online. It's not cheap, though. But if you want to find high-res images, you can go to codexsinaiticus.org. If you recall from last time, in the main, the manuscript of Codex Sinaiticus, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, generally speaking, is in 4 columns of text. Very neat and tidy, nicely justified, and that's generally true across the board, and it's in a standard biblical majuscule, as we like to call it. And if we zoom in, you'll just notice a few things I called attention to last time. You have some scribal corrections out in the margins here, and this one's kind of cool. It has that little sort of squiggly obelisk here that also ties to the same place in the text. It's like a little footnote indicator. You have an above-the-line correction here and here and here. Something going on here as well. And as mentioned last time, the numerous scribes who worked on not only producing Sinaiticus initially, and there were several of them, both Old and New Testament, but those who came along later to edit, revise, correct it, they did a lot of work on the manuscript. And so this is actually a fairly tame page. It doesn't have a lot going on. Some pages just have all sorts of corrections and marginal annotations that span the centuries. And so just a good reminder that this manuscript was used for a long time and was quite valuable, heavily worked over, and you'll see that reflected in critical apparatuses as well. Now, we're going to fast forward to the start of the Psalter, and the Psalms actually pick up after the 12 prophets. And so here on the left-hand side, you have, once again, 1 column, 2 columns, 3 columns, and you would have a 4th column if the scribe needed it. You can see the text on the prior side of the folio bleeding through there. However, when you pivot to the Psalms, you'll notice that we're now going to a 2-column format, and we'll see this more clearly here in just a second. And that is consistent for poetry in this particular manuscript, that the Psalms, Proverbs, Wisdom of Solomon, one of the apocryphal writings, they all tend to take a 2-column format, which gave them much more space, is a bit more generous, also enabled them to, as we'll see, track with sense lines a bit better as opposed to just doing everything in this very wooden, just text-justified way. And so that's a notable feature when you transition into the Psalms. Now, one thing to point out just for fun here, if you zoom in to the end of the 12 prophets, you'll see that this is the book of Malachi, Malachias there, as you might be able to read it. The scribe here has put a nice little coronus, that's a little decorative end piece, telling you that we've gotten to the end. And this scribe says, and they added some spacing just to be cute, I suppose, prophetes, so prophet. And then, somewhat uniquely, as far as I'm aware, they added angelos, which would not be angel. In this case, it would be messenger. So it's a prophet and a messenger, Malachi. And you'll actually see this angelos in the text critical apparatus for, at least for Codex Sinaiticus, for Malachi. So that's kind of interesting, just a little flair that the scribe added describing the end of this book. And then you see IB, Iota Beta. And I covered this in the Vaticanus videos. This represents a number. Iota is 10, Beta is 12. You'll notice it has lines above and below. So, Beta is 2. And so you put those together, this is 12. This signals the end of the 12 prophets, which were kind of viewed as an entity there. So a lot of interesting stuff there tucked into the sort of the subscript of Malachi. Let's go up to the top of the Psalter. One thing you'll notice, and this is also mentioned in the critical apparatuses, there is no title for the Psalms here. If you were to look at Vaticanus, and we'll eventually take a look at Alexandrinus as examples, they will say something like Psalms or the Psalter. But for whatever reason, the scribe did not include that in Codex Sinaiticus, which I find to be quite interesting. It just starts If we zoom out a bit, you'll notice a few features that are worth pointing out. First off, you'll see that the first one has the letter alpha here. That's 1. This is a beta, so that's 2, Psalm 2. This is a gamma, so this is the start of Psalm 3, and so on. So these psalms were numbered, and the handwriting does appear to be the same handwriting of the original scribe who's writing the actual text itself. You'll also see, as I mentioned, that when you get to the end of a line, instead of just wrapping and then sort of continuing and filling up all the space, what the scribe has done is basically divided the psalm into its appropriate strophes or clauses, and when he gets to the end, he does a little line break, starts over on the next line. And so it's more jagged, but what that does is allow you to basically treat each of these as a sort of sense unit, or like this one would be a sense unit. That's an entire line of the psalm. And they do a quite a good job of dividing up the text, very similar to what you would see in a modern edition. So it's not just sort of running purely in sort of scriptio continuum. It's going to try to respect the clausal layout of the text. That being said, you do still see some efforts to squeeze stuff in sometimes to kind of make that work, as you can see the difference in size there at the end. Another thing to point out, let's zoom in a bit, is this is the end of Psalm 2. It ends with ep alto. Then you have the scribe added like a little line here, basically to indicate that that's essentially the end of the psalm. Notice they pivoted to a different color. Then you have the very first superscript. Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 don't have superscripts. Psalm 3 is the start of that, so it's the Psalmos to Dawid, etc., etc. We'll come back to that down the road. The same scribe is writing it. You'll notice it's the exact same paleography, so far as I can tell at least. But they have shifted to a reddish ink to distinguish this from the actual biblical text below and above it. What's interesting, though, is that the same scribe who is doing the numbering starts the number after the superscript. I find that to be very, very fascinating. Of course, there's a debate in the modern age as to whether we should treat the superscripts, both in Hebrew and, in this case, in Greek, as part of the text or not. Well, it appears that this scribe is trying to draw attention that this is not part of the actual text. The proper psalm actually begins here with the first line. And so they're doing a lot of interesting things to make that clear. You'll also notice that Psalm 3 is the first psalm that has the somewhat famous, notoriously ambiguous Selah in Hebrew, which folks debate what that is. It is very consistently translated in the Greek Psalter with dia psalma, which essentially is a made-up word. It has psalm sort of baked into it with the dia preposition thrown on the front end. You'll see that over and over again. Most of the time when you'll see a Selah in the Hebrew, it'll be reflected with the dia psalma. Notice, at least in this scribe's opinion, because they put it in that red ink, which they had also used for the superscript, maybe that implies that they didn't think it was sort of a key part of the text. Maybe they're aware that it's some sort of musical notation. We simply don't know, but that I find to be quite interesting. Now, let's go back to Psalm 2. I want to point out a few things. First of all, you'll see the beta here showing the start, and the scribe has said, look, this is the end of Psalm 1. They put a little line there. Here's what's really interesting about Psalm 2, and it's not the only one that does this. The scribe has thrown in a dia psalma, and there is no Selah in the Hebrew of Psalm 2. At least not in the Masoretic text. Now, maybe the Hebrew that this scribe was, or at least the translator, the original translator, which would, of course, not be the Vaticanus scribe, the Sinaiticus scribe, maybe it had Selah in there. Don't know. But either way, they just kind of throw it in there. I find that to be interesting. So this is not in the Masoretic. This is not there, or any known Hebrew that I'm aware of. So go figure. That's a very interesting feature. Well, covered a bunch of different little odds and ends. Let's just read one verse just to get started. Covered this also in regular daily dose, but it's helpful just to take a look at it in this script to continue getting some practice. So we'll just look at verse 1 here. And so if you want to see it nice and clean with more of my comments and so forth in translation, you can look at that particular video of Psalm 2:1. But let's work our way through it. We start with a hina. And notice it does, maybe not original, it's hard to tell, but there is a diaeresis there, which functions in this case kind of like a rough breathing mark, at least in a rudimentary way. So hina, T, and then ephruoxon. So why do the ethne, see ethne there, and we can actually just go ahead and throw the words up on the screen. So why do the ethne sort of militate against and complain and create problems? Kai Lioi, notice it's inarticular or inarthrous there. Lio emele, and it's interesting, teson, so the end of that verb, so it's emele teson, picks up on the next line, and so you have emele there on this line, you have teson on this line. And the scribe here, and they don't always do this, adds just a little dipple here that shows you that the word continues so that you might not be confused that that's somehow like a third singular ending or something. And so why do the peoples deliberate is a good translation of melatao or something like that. And then you have kana here. Notice there's no punctuation like we have this question mark there. And so why do they deliberate in vain or futility or something along those lines? So in terms of the paleography, you'll notice that the fees tend to be quite prominent, although that's not always true across the board in Sinaiticus. The xi here is quite, I don't know, interesting, I think. And you have to get used to that across the different scribal hands. Everything else is pretty predictable. I mentioned this, though, previously. It's not as bad here on this particular line, except for maybe with this t. A lot of the horizontal strokes in this particular hand, and this is true for a lot of the biblical majuscules, are very thin. The vertical strokes tend to be pretty prominent, so you see it here and here and here and so forth. But the horizontal strokes, like in this theta, even this epsilon here, the middle line of this eta, and so forth, often are quite faint, and that is driven by the shape of the stylus and how they did it in terms of the angle that you would hold it at and so forth. So that's a very common feature. And so in certain situations, this is pretty clear on this page, but some situations it gets quite difficult to read if the ink is faded a lot. It's sometimes difficult to tell what those letters are, but you get used to it over time. So anyway, good to get our feet wet a bit here in the Psalms, and thanks for tuning in.